Now, if you want to record music, then obviously you're gonna need some sounds to record. Now, those sounds can be generated either by virtual instruments or by what we might call real instruments. Now, which of the two should you go for? Let's talk about that today. Hey everyone, my name is Supercy Jules. Welcome to Supercy and welcome to Budget Studio. In this series, I'm exploring the most affordable, good alternatives for equipment in your home studio. So virtual instruments versus real instruments. That's what I'm going to talk about today, and of course within the context of being on a budget. Well, if it would only come down to price, the answer would be very straightforward. Because usually, virtual instruments are a lot less expensive than real instruments. So for example, how much money would you have to pay to buy a new, at least decent sounding bass guitar? $200, $300 or euros? Maybe 100 if you're lucky. But that would be a pretty fair lower limit, isn't it? Now let's talk about virtual instruments. For $200 or $300, you can buy some of the very best virtual bass guitar instruments on the market. You know how much you would have to pay for the best bass guitar? Well, I'm not even sure, but I know it would be thousands of dollars or euros. And on top of that, usually these virtual bass instruments come with a lot of extra sound tweaking options. So sometimes they come with several different virtual bass amps to choose from. Usually they come with a lot of built-in effects you can apply. And sometimes they even come with different sounds. So basically different virtual bass sounds built into one instrument. So a lot of extra options. Now, if you know this, then you might ask yourself, then why would anyone still consider buying a real instrument? Now, first of all, you might want to buy a real instrument because you simply want to learn how to play that instrument, which is a very good thing to do, by the way. I would recommend it to anyone because it's very good for the development of you as a musician. And on top of that, and maybe even more importantly, it's really a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun to play a musical instrument. So that is one reason why you would want to buy a real instrument, but more relevantly, why would you want to buy a real instrument for music production, so music recording? Well, I would say mainly authenticity. So back in the days before we had computers, or at least not these advanced computers like we have today, we didn't have all these virtual instruments like we have today. We didn't even really have samples like we have today. Nowadays you can download tons of samples from the internet for free. Back then you could buy a sampler, which I did by the way, but it cost me something like, well, converted into today's currency, it would be about a few thousand euros. And it had less capabilities than some of the virtual samplers you can download from the internet today for free. Can you imagine? Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that back then, if you wanted to do anything in music recording, you kinda had to learn how to play an instrument, because it was basically the only way to create music. And obviously that was also the way that songs were recorded. So someone actually really played a real guitar and that was recorded. And someone played a real bass guitar and that was recorded. So that way of working, that philosophy basically, kind of stuck with us. And to this day, many people still consider that way of working as the authentic way of recording music. And the sounds coming from those real instruments are very often still considered authentic sounds. Now, many songs are still being recorded like that, but even for many people in electronic music, for instance, they still feature a lot of these sounds in their songs. And in our perception, because of what we're used to, it kind of gives the recordings something extra, something authentic. Now, even though the development of these virtual instruments has come a long way, it's gotten very close to the real thing. But still, in some cases, if you really listen close enough, you can sometimes still hear some differences between virtual and real instruments. And not always in the sounds themselves, but very often because of the difference in technique of playing. Now, virtual instruments are usually played on a keyboard. Now, pressing down keys on a keyboard obviously is a different technique than pulling a string on a bass guitar, for instance. And there are some things that you can do with strings that you cannot do with a keyboard. You know, for instance, you can bend strings or you can slide over strings. Cannot do that with a keyboard. You know, you can mimic those techniques on a keyboard, but it's not always going to sound exactly the same as the real thing. So that might be another reason why someone might want to go for real instruments. Authenticity. Now, should you go for real instruments? Well, I would say if you have a very, very strong need that your recordings should sound like they were recorded with real instruments, and there cannot be a hint that they weren't recorded with real instruments, and you have the money, buy real instruments. Or if you're very sentimental about recording with real instruments, many people are, many people just don't want to conform to recording with virtual instruments. Well, if that is the case, again, if you have the money, go for real instruments. Otherwise, especially if you're on a budget, use virtual instruments. You know, surely if you're making electronic music, for instance, and you're not really interested in authentic sounds, then don't even bother. I mean, there are a lot of good virtual instruments out there that you can get for very little money or sometimes even for free. You know, so don't even bother with real instruments. But even if you do have a need for authentic sounds, if you're on a budget, I would still definitely recommend using virtual instruments. Because, yes, again, if you really listen closely, you probably will be able to hear some differences between virtual instruments and real instruments. But realistically, I mean, there are some really, really good virtual bass guitar instruments out there. There are some really, really good virtual guitar instruments out there, etc. Now, if these instruments are applied smart enough, you're probably not even gonna notice, and you're probably not even gonna care if they were recorded with real instruments or if they were recorded with emulated instruments. And of course, again, the biggest benefit of using virtual instruments, we're talking budget studio, the price. You can buy those virtual instruments for a fraction of the price of what you would normally have to pay for those real instruments. So that's it. That's my view on this issue. If you're interested in seeing more videos like this, then consider subscribing. I'm uploading a new Budget Studio video every week on Monday. For now, thank you for watching, and I will talk to you next time.